Dana Whitfield had done the math 3 times in the car before she even got out, sitting in the parking lot with her phone open to her banking app, watching the number stay stubbornly the same no matter how many times she recalculated it in her head. She had done it again standing in the cereal aisle, comparing prices between the brand Eli liked and the generic version that was $1.40 cheaper, doing the silent arithmetic that had become as automatic to her as breathing. She had done it a 4th time at the register while the cashier scanned her items one by one, watching the total climb on the small screen. And every time the number came out the same, which was that she was $11.40 short, and there was nothing in her account to cover it. And the only thing left to do was decide what to put back. She was 34 years old. She had 2 children, Eli, who was 9, and Maya, who was 6, waiting at home with her mother because Dana had needed to do this trip alone, without the particular pressure of small faces watching her count and recount and decide. She worked as a home health aide for an agency that paid her by the visit rather than by the hour, which meant her income fluctuated in ways that made budgeting an exercise in constant recalibration, good weeks and thin weeks arriving without much warning, and this had been a thin week. 2 clients had canceled their visits. One had moved into a facility that no longer needed Dana's services, and the math that had worked on Sunday no longer worked by Thursday. She had tried that morning to pick up an additional visit through the agency's last-minute scheduling system, but nothing had come through in time, and by the time she left for the store, she had already accepted that this week was simply going to be one of the thin ones, the kind she had learned over years of this work. To navigate rather than panic about, even though the navigating itself never stopped costing her something, she had been careful. She wanted this fact to be clear to herself, standing at the register, even if no one else in the store would ever know it. She had not bought anything unnecessary. She had a coupon for the detergent. She had chosen the store brand cereal instead of the one Eli liked because the store brand was $1.40 cheaper. She had put back, before she even got to the register, the strawberries that Maya had asked for. Because strawberries were a luxury this particular week, even though Maya loved them and even though Dana hated saying no to her daughter for something as small as fruit, the cashier, a young man with a name tag that said Dimitri, reached the total and read it out, and Dana looked at her phone, where she had pulled up her banking app preemptively because she had known, walking in, that this was going to be close. The number on her phone said $112.16. The number Dimitri had read out was $123.56. She felt the particular heat that comes with this specific kind of public mathematics, the heat of standing in a line with people behind you while you work out in real time. What you can afford to keep being a person who needs, and what you have to give back to become a person who manages. She had been here before. Not at this store. Not with this exact arithmetic, but in this position, this specific posture of scanning her own bags in her mind, trying to identify what could go, what was the least essential thing among things that were already only the essentials. She told Dimitri she needed to put a few things back. He said that was fine, no rush, with the particular kindness of a young person who had clearly been told to say this and who also seemed to mean it, which Dana appreciated more than she had words for in the moment. She reached into the bag closest to her and pulled out the bag of frozen chicken thighs, the cheapest protein she had been able to find. $11 for a bag that would stretch across several meals if she was careful with it. The kind of careful that had become so habitual she barely registered it as deprivation anymore. She handed it back to Dimitri. It was not quite enough. She was still short by 40 cents. She felt the line behind her the way you feel weather, an ambient pressure she could not quite locate in any single person's face, but that she registered anyway. The small shifts of people checking their phones. The specific quality of patience that has a limit and is approaching it. She reached for the bag again, trying to decide between the bread and the eggs, both of which felt impossible to give up, both of which her children would need this week, regardless of what else happened. A voice behind her said, "I've got it." She turned. The man behind her in line was perhaps 70, tall, wearing a flannel shirt and work boots that had the specific wear of someone who had spent a career doing something physical, a single bag of groceries of his own waiting on the belt behind hers. mostly canned soup and bread and a small bag of dog food. He was already reaching for his wallet. Dana said, "No, please, that's not necessary," in the reflexive way that people say this when they have spent years building a wall around the specific shame of needing help in front of strangers. A wall that exists not because help itself is shameful, but because the world has taught most people, slowly and repeatedly, that needing help in public is something to apologize for. The man said it again. "The same 3 words, I've got it," but this time with a small addition, said gently, not as an argument but as a simple correction to whatever Dana had just said. He said, "I've got it. Let me." There was something in the way he said "let me" that Dana would think about for a long time afterward, the way it reframed the entire transaction, the way it suggested that what he was doing was not charity directed downward at her, but something closer to a request, and asking for the chance to do this small thing, as if Dana were the one in a position to grant him something rather than the other way around. She looked at him for a moment. She looked at Dmitri, who was waiting with the kind of patient neutrality that good cashiers develop, neither rushing the moment nor making it more than it needed to be. She looked at the bag of chicken thighs sitting on the counter, already set aside, already half gone in her own accounting of the week. She said, "I can't let you do that." He said, "You're not letting me do anything." "I'm just doing it." He handed Dmitri a card before Dana could say anything else, and Dmitri, glancing at Dana with an expression that asked permission she had not quite given, but that she found herself in that moment unable to refuse, ran the man's card for the difference. The man's name was Walter Greer. He told her this while they were both gathering their bags, in the specific brief intimacy that exists between 2 people who have just shared an unusual moment in a checkout line and are trying to figure out how to close it gracefully. Dana thanked him. She felt the specific awkwardness of gratitude that arrives faster and larger than you are prepared to express it, the words feeling inadequate the moment they left her mouth. He waved it off, not dismissively, but with the ease of someone who genuinely did not want the moment weighted down with more than it needed to carry. He asked if she had kids. She said 2, Eli and Maya. He said his own kids were grown now, that he had 3 of them, that his wife had passed 4 years ago, that he lived alone now in a house outside of town with more rooms than he needed, and a dog who had become, in the last 4 years, his primary daily companion. He said this not as a bid for sympathy, but as the kind of small disclosure that happens naturally when 2 strangers find themselves talking longer than the situation strictly required. Dana asked him why he had done it. Not accusingly, not suspiciously, but with the genuine curiosity of someone trying to understand a piece of behavior that did not fit the pattern of most interactions she had with strangers. Walter thought about this for a moment before answering. He said that his wife, Margaret, had been the kind of person who could not walk past someone who needed something small, that she had spent 40 years doing exactly what he had just done, paying for things in checkout lines, covering tabs at diners for people she did not know. The specific habit of a woman who believed that most of the suffering in the world happened in small enough increments that small enough acts could meaningfully address at least some of it. He said that since she died, he had found that doing the things she used to do was one of the few ways he had found to feel close to her, that he was not a naturally generous man in the way Margaret had been, that he had to make himself do it, had to remember to look for the moments she would have noticed automatically, but that he had decided, somewhere in the first year after losing her, that this was a discipline worth keeping, even though it did not come naturally to him. Dana stood in the parking lot with her bags after this conversation and found that she was, unexpectedly, close to crying, not from the $11.40, which she would have found a way through regardless, would have managed by putting back the chicken or skipping something else later in the week, the way she had managed every thin week before this one. She was close to crying because of the specific quality of being seen that the encounter had contained, the fact that a stranger had looked at her briefly and decided that her dignity mattered enough to protect, that he had found a way to help that did not require her to perform need or gratitude beyond what felt natural, that he had framed his own generosity as a request rather than a gift, which had made it possible for her to accept it without the particular shame she usually associated with, accepting things she could not reciprocate. She drove home thinking about Walter Greer and his wife Margaret and the discipline of doing things that did not come naturally because someone you loved would have done them automatically. She thought about this for the rest of the evening, while she made dinner with the groceries she had managed to keep, while she helped Eli with his math homework at the kitchen table and braided Maya's hair before bed, listening to her daughter narrate, in the specific stream of consciousness way of 6-year-olds, an entirely unrelated story about something that had happened at school that day. The small domestic rhythm of her evening continued as it always did, but it carried inside it now a small additional weight, the specific kind of weight that good things sometimes leave behind, a residue of having been treated with more care than the situation strictly required, a feeling she found herself returning to long after the children were asleep and the house had gone quiet around her. She did not expect to see Walter Greer again. This was, she assumed, simply how these things worked. A single, unrepeatable kindness from a stranger who lived somewhere outside of town, in a life that did not naturally intersect with hers, a story she would tell occasionally for years. The man who paid for her chicken at the grocery store, the small good thing that had happened on a hard week. But she did see him again, 3 weeks later in the same grocery store. At almost the same time of day, both of them apparently creatures of habit who shopped on Thursday evenings after work. He recognized her before she recognized him, said her name across the cereal aisle, and she turned and felt a small genuine pleasure at seeing him. The specific warmth of running into someone who had been kind to you, a feeling distinct from running into an ordinary acquaintance. They talked for a few minutes in the aisle. He asked about Eli and Maya by name, which surprised her, that he had remembered the names from a single conversation 3 weeks earlier. She asked about his dog, whose name she remembered was Buster. They talked about nothing important, the texture of small talk between people who are becoming, almost without deciding to, something more than strangers. This became, over the following months, a pattern. Dana and Walter ran into each other at the grocery store with enough regularity that it stopped feeling like coincidence and started feeling like something closer to a standing arrangement neither of them had explicitly made. They began timing their trips, not always consciously, around the likelihood of running into each other. Walter started bringing dog treats for Buster that he would mention to Maya, who had developed an intense interest in Buster despite never having met him, an interest that led eventually to an actual meeting. It was Walter who suggested it, in October, 6 months after the grocery store, that Dana and the children might want to come see his place sometime, that he had a yard Buster liked to run in, that he made a chili that his late wife had always said was the best thing he cooked, that it would be no trouble at all to have them out for a Sunday afternoon. Dana hesitated before agreeing, the specific hesitation of a single mother who has learned to be careful about which adults she introduces into her children's lives, who has learned that not everyone who appears kind in a checkout line is necessarily safe in a more sustained context. But something about Walter, the consistency of him across the months of grocery store conversations, the way he talked about Margaret with a grief that had clearly never curdled into anything bitter or strange, the specific steadiness of him, made her trust her own assessment that this was safe. The first visit to Walter's house became, over the following year, a regular occurrence. Sunday afternoons every few weeks, sometimes more often. Eli, who had lost his own grandfather 2 years before any of this began, attached himself to Walter with the specific intensity that children sometimes bring to relationships that fill a gap they cannot fully articulate. Walter taught him to fish in the small pond behind his property. Maya, for her part, became Buster's primary playmate, the two of them running across Walter's yard with the specific joy of a child and a dog who have found in each other exactly what they were each missing. Dana watched all of this happen with a complicated mixture of gratitude and caution that took her a long time to resolve into something simpler. She had spent years protecting her children from instability, from adults who appeared and then disappeared, from the specific damage that inconsistent presence can do to children who have already lost something. In their case, a father who had left when Maya was 2 and who had not been consistently present since. She watched Walter's consistency build. month after month, Sunday after Sunday, and she found herself, slowly, allowing herself to trust it in a way she had not initially planned to. What Dana did not fully understand, for most of that first year, was what the relationship was doing for Walter. The specific way that Eli and Maya had begun to fill something in his life that had been empty since Margaret died. The way his house, which had felt, in his own private accounting, like a place where he was simply waiting out the remainder of his life after losing the person who had made it feel alive, had become instead a place with a regular rhythm again, a place where a 6-year-old's laughter carried through the rooms on Sunday afternoons, where a 9-year-old asked him questions about fishing and woodworking and the specific mechanics of how things worked, questions Walter found himself looking forward to answering all week. He told her this eventually on a Sunday evening in the following spring, almost exactly a year after the grocery store, while the children played in the yard and Dana helped him clean up after dinner. He said that he had assumed, after Margaret died, that the remainder of his life would simply be a kind of waiting, that he would maintain the discipline of small kindnesses because it kept him connected to who Margaret had been, but that he had not expected anything to actually fill the specific silence she had left behind. He said that Eli and Maya had filled it in a way he had not thought possible, that he found himself for the first time in 4 years, looking forward to specific days of the week rather than simply moving through them. Dana said she was glad, and meant it, and then found herself saying something she had not planned to say, that her own father had died when she was young, that she had grown up without the specific steadiness that a grandfather figure could provide, and that watching Walter with Eli and Maya had given her something she had not known she was still missing, a vicarious version of a relationship she had never had herself. They stood in the kitchen for a moment after this exchange, both of them aware that something had shifted slightly in the conversation, that they had moved from the specific gratitude of a kindness repaid through ongoing friendship into something that required a different kind of acknowledgement. Walter said, carefully, choosing his words the way a man does when he understands the weight they might carry, that he did not want to overstep, that he understood Dana had her own family, her own mother who helped with the children, her own structures that had been built before he ever entered the picture, and that did not need his presence to function. He said he simply wanted her to know that whatever this was, whatever role he had ended up occupying in her children's lives, he took it seriously, that he was not going anywhere, that if she was comfortable with it, he would like to continue being a consistent presence for as long as he was able to be one. Dana said she would like that too. She said it simply, without the elaborate qualification she might have used a year earlier, when the wariness of single motherhood had still required her to hedge even her gratitude. The relationship continued and deepened over the following 2 years. Walter became, in practice if not in any formal sense, something like a grandfather to Eli and Maya, present at school events when Dana's schedule made it difficult to attend everything alone, present at birthdays, present at Eli's first soccer tournament, where he stood on the sideline and cheered louder than anyone else there. Present in the specific accumulated way that family becomes family, not through any single dramatic gesture, but through the steady accumulation of small, consistent presences over time. He learned the names of Eli's teachers and Maya's best friend from kindergarten. He kept a drawer in his kitchen stocked with the specific snacks each of them preferred. Distinct preferences he had tracked without being asked to track them, simply because he paid attention in the way that people pay attention to things that matter to them. He helped, too, in ways that mattered practically. When Dana's car broke down in a way that would have cost more to fix than she had, Walter quietly covered it, framing it again as something he wanted to do rather than something she needed, a pattern she had come to recognize and, eventually, to accept without the initial resistance that had characterized the chicken thighs in the checkout line 2 years earlier. When Eli needed a tutor for math, Walter, who had spent 30 years as an engineer before retiring, simply began tutoring him himself on Wednesday evenings, turning what could have been an expense into something that deepened their relationship further. The two of them hunched over the kitchen table with worksheets and a calculator, Walter explaining fractions with the same patience he had once brought to training younger engineers at the firm where he had spent his career. Maya, not to be left out, began insisting on her own Wednesday evening lessons, even though she was still too young for most of what Eli was learning. And Walter, without complaint, found small things to teach her too. Simple addition with dried beans from his pantry, counting games that kept her occupied at the same table where her brother worked. 3 years after the grocery store, on a Thursday evening that happened to fall on the anniversary, though neither of them had planned it that way, Walter asked Dana if she would consider something he had been thinking about for a while. They were sitting on his porch after dinner, the children asleep in the guest room where they had taken to staying over on Saturday nights. A development that had happened gradually enough that neither of them had marked any single moment as the beginning of it. He said he had been to see his attorney. He said that he did not have any close family beyond a sister in Ohio he saw twice a year and his own children, who were grown and settled in other states with their own families, financially secure in ways that meant his estate was not something they particularly needed. He said he wanted to formalize, in his will, a provision for Eli and Maya's education, a fund that would be there regardless of what happened to him, regardless of whether their relationship continued in exactly its current shape, because he had come to think of them in the specific and uncomplicated way that love sometimes arrives without permission, as something like grandchildren, and he wanted that fact to outlast whatever years he had left. Dana sat with this for a long moment, the porch quiet around her except for the distant sound of crickets and, somewhere inside, the soft creak of the guest room door as one of the children turned over in their sleep. She thought about the $11.40. The specific smallness of the original moment, the way it had seemed at the time, like exactly what it appeared to be, a kind stranger covering a grocery bill, a moment she might have told as an anecdote at a dinner party and then largely forgotten. She thought about how completely that small moment had grown into something neither of them could have predicted, standing in that checkout line. The way a single decision to say "I've got it" had opened into 3 years of Sunday afternoons and fishing trips and math tutoring and overnight stays and a friendship that had become, gradually and then all at once, something closer to family. The kind of family that is built rather than given, chosen rather than inherited, and somehow, for that reason, no less real. She said yes. She said it was an enormous thing to offer, and that she did not know how to thank him properly. The same inadequate gratitude she had felt in the grocery store parking lot 3 years earlier, returning now in a larger and more permanent form. Walter said the same thing he had said in the checkout line, the same 3 words that had started all of it. "Let me." He said it again, gently, the way he had said it the first time, as if the entire relationship that had grown between them in the 3 years since was simply an extension of that original sentence. An ongoing permission he kept asking for and that she kept, gradually and then completely, learning to grant. "Before you go, I want you to sit with something. The world is full of small moments like the one in that checkout line. The kind that pass by hundreds of times a day in grocery stores and parking lots and waiting rooms across every city. Moments that could go one of several ways. Someone notices and does something small, or someone notices and decides it is not their place, or someone simply does not notice at all, moving through the world with their attention pointed somewhere else entirely. Walter Greer's 3 words, "I've got it," cost him $11.40 that Thursday evening. They ended up costing him, over the following years, far more than that, in time and attention and the steady accumulated effort of showing up. But what he received in return, the specific filling of a silence that had been sitting in his house since Margaret died, was something money could never have purchased on its own. Dana Whitfield walked into that grocery store ashamed of being $11 short. She walked out having met a man who would become, over the following years, family. Tell me in the comments, has a small act of kindness from a stranger ever turned into something larger in your own life? I want to hear about it, and if this story moved you, share it today with someone who needs to be reminded that the small moments matter more than we usually allow ourselves to believe. Subscribe and turn on the bell. The next story is coming. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. I will see you in the next one.